one more minute to wait until we start. Okay, I think that we have a solid number of the participants who have already joined. And once again, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining our webinar, which we as CMS International BV are holding today for you to make a very brief introduction of what's going on in Russia these days, what are the initiatives which are being discussed, what is currently businesses doing in Russia, and what are the legislators are doing as an answer to what's happening these days. So we are here with you for 75 minutes, where we will try to speak for not more than 1 hour and keep around 15 minutes to answer your questions. For those, you may use the chat window anytime to put your question over there, or you may use the voice to talk through your questions at the very end of our webinar. Just a short introduction about ourselves. As you have already heard that a lot of consultants, international consultants, including law firms, are going local these days. CMS in this row as well. So we are today as CMS International BV, but probably in a couple of weeks or so, we will reach out to you with our new branding and naming, which will only mean the change of the name, whereas the whole team will stay here in Moscow to serve you with any questions you may have. So rely on us, stay with us, keep on subscribing to our channels on Telegram or alerts which you may receive through emails, and we will be here for you to share all the news which are happening these days in Russia. So today we will be talking through a number of issues, but we grouped them in a way so that you receive the snapshot of the most important changes which were introduced in Russia throughout the previous 3 years, including the major systematic changes in the tax legislation, such as transfer pricing and some other provisions of the tax law. We will guide you through the temporary measures of the government, which were introduced to improve the company's liquidity and to help the companies in the other ways. We will also share insights from the Federal Tax Service and the government about what's being discussed right now, what's on the radar and what's on the agenda. We will also talk through the current business landscape, what international businesses are doing, what options do they consider, and how do they implement those options in compliance with the legal and tax requirements in Russia. As I said, at the very end, we will be happy to address any of your questions, which again you may put in the chat box on your settings and panels. Recording will also be shared with you once we complete the webinar. We will very much appreciate if you can complete the feedback form, which also will be shared at the very end of the webinar. Today with you, both of us, myself, Olga Odintsova, and Maria Kabanova, will be present. I'm the partner with the tax practice, and Maria is the senior associate with the tax practice as well. So let's start with the content, and I'm happy to pass the word to Maria, who will guide you through the major systematic changes in the tax legislation.
Yes, thank you, Olga, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I was happy to see many familiar faces among the people registered, and sincerely hope that you will find the content of today's webinar useful for you. So the first topic I would like to speak about is the changes recently introduced to the transfer pricing rules applicable in Russia, and more specifically what is going on in the transfer pricing domain, which I personally expect to be particularly developing in the next couple of years. So the first change, which was actually quite long awaited by the Russian taxpayers, was the increase of the revenue threshold for the cross-border intergroup transactions to be recognized as controlled for the transfer pricing purposes. Actually, this threshold was doubled from 60 to 120 million Russian rubles. And this new threshold will be applicable starting from 2022, meaning that it will apply to the transactions that will be documented in 2023. Why this change was so much weighted is because the administration and documentation of the minor intergroup flows actually required quite material efforts from the side of the tax authorities, and in practice sometimes the costs and the efforts associated with the documentation of such flows exceeded any potential risks stemming from the transfer pricing rules application to them. As a short reminder here is that the threshold is calculated separately for each foreign-related counterparty, but based on all the transactions performed with this counterparty and not a transaction by transaction way. Why this change was only implemented now is most probably because the legislative authorities were seeking to somehow neutralize for the taxpayers the effect of the material volatility of the Russian currency, Russian rubles, during 2022. But actually, I did not even dare to put an euro or US dollar equivalent on this slide for you today, because when this rule was implemented, this new threshold was about 1 million euros, and now, based on the current rate, it is closer to 2 million euros. So you can imagine the volatility here, but we will see again closer to the year end what it will bring to us. Another minor change was the slight reduction of the scope of the domestic control transactions. Sorry, Oleg, can you please come back?
Yes.
But I will not be digging into many detail here because it is more relevant for the domestic intergroup flows. And also the penalties for deviation from the arm's length level, if such a deviation is revealed as a result of a specific transfer pricing tax audit, will not apply for the transactions which are performed in 2022-2023. Again, this change is quite an important one because the penalty for non-compliance with the transfer pricing requirements in terms of the arm's length level of the prices is 40%, which is quite material. But one thing I would need to warn you about here is that under the Russian law, the penalty is not applicable in case the taxpayer maintains proper transfer pricing documentation justifying its prices in controlled transactions. Which is why I saw in practice that some taxpayers construe this particular change in a way that they can release themselves from preparation of TP documentation for this period. And I would actually warn you against this because although the penalties will not be applicable in the stated period, as the tax authorities pronounced numerous times during this months, they will be paying particular attention to the transfer pricing rules compliance in 2022 and probably 2023 as well, because they understand that in the current legislative limitations we have in Russia from the currency control standpoint, which is definitely a separate topic, Russian taxpayers do not have many ways to transfer monies abroad, which is why the tax authorities could anticipate that the taxpayers may be using transfer pricing simply to transfer cash, and they will be controlling this question with particular scrutiny. One more point to be mentioned on this slide, a very important one, is that this March, Russian Federal Tax Service, for the first time, have issued a letter, a very short one, but still important, where they announced that the loss-making transaction occurring in 2022 may still be considered to be arm's length because Russian tax authorities understand the extraordinary and unprecedented pressure from the sanctions which is faced by the Russian taxpayers now. But several important points to note here is first that the scope of application of this letter is very limited. It was specifically issued for the taxpayers engaged in manufacturing and exportation of the goods from Russia, because the tax authorities explain that they have clear vision why these particular taxpayers are influenced by this letter. And also this letter makes reference specifically to the sanctions, while in practice what we see Russian taxpayers suffer not immediately maybe from the sanctions, but more generally the economic environment which is being created now, including the volatility of the foreign currencies, the suspension of the business activities, either of the companies themselves or of their counterparties, the difficulties with logistics and so on and so forth. And one very important initiative that I would like to announce here is that both Olga and myself in April visited the meeting of the Advisory Council of the Federal Tax Service with the foreign investors in Russia, where this particular question was discussed, since the foreign businesses asked to extend the provisions of this letter also to the companies engaged in importation of goods or works or services in Russia, which can definitely also generate losses in the current environment. And the representatives of the Federal Tax Service said that, well, they do not see the immediate influence on the companies engaged in importation because quite frequently these companies are qualified as routine distributors who are used to reinvoicing their costs to the final consumers through simple increase of the prices, which in my opinion is quite naive, is quite a naive thing to say, because for various and obvious economic reasons it is not always possible, but still. The tax authorities says that they will be ready to reconsider their position and their approach to the extent that they get from the taxpayers the specific examples and maybe even specific calculations proving that they really suffer from the current economic environments and may have issues with the transfer pricing compliance. In this context, our tax team and me personally, with the help of various business associations, have initiated the job to collect from the businesses their examples and their concerns and maybe their suggestions in the transfer pricing domain. And once we collect this data, we will prepare a sort of an aggregated suggestion to the Federal Tax Service, obviously without disclosing the names of the taxpayers unless they specifically wanted to, in order maybe to negotiate with the tax authorities some more initiatives and some more help to the business in the transfer pricing domain. We will be circulating the specific mailing in this respect very shortly after the webinar, but I invite all of you colleagues to reach to me or to your other trusted contact in CMS to share your vision and your concerns to contribute to these initiatives, and maybe together we can come up with some new incentives for you guys. So moving for the next slide, and I will not be stopping in too much detail here. One more initiative which was adopted in the transfer pricing domain was the extension of the scope of the safe harbor threshold for the interest rates in the intergroup loans. Actually, this initiative was already implemented during the pandemic, where the tax authorities understood the increased need in financing for the Russian taxpayers and extended the scope of the safe harbors. And now this initiative is prolonged until 31st of December 2023, with one small but important difference from the rules applicable back during the pandemic, is that now formally under the tax code, even for the cross-border outbound loans denominated in the Russian rubles, the interest rate may be set already at the level of 0%, which basically may be construed as a permission to provide, to temporarily provide the loans at 0% rate. However, I will still be very cautious with this particular initiative, first of all, because together with the tax rules, the applicable limitation in the currency control domain should be considered here, but also because although the 0% rate is eligible under the transfer pricing rules, the risk of potential requalification of this flow could still remain, especially if the tax authorities come and see that, for example, the company wanted to pay out the dividends but couldn't do so due to existing limitations and try to use this mechanism to optimize their taxes. So, for example, in this particular case, the tax risks may still occur. And moving to the next slide, some other initiatives and some other changes I wanted to speak about is first the changes to the thin capitalization rules calculation in Russia. Again, these changes are temporary and they will only apply until the end of 2023. And again, these changes are very similar, practically identical to what was applicable during the pandemic. So just to cut the long story short, the idea of the changes is that the Russian taxpayers should be calculating the debt and the equity part for the thin capitalization purposes without taking into account the material volatility of the Russian rubles taking place after 1st of February 2022. Which is again a good news to the taxpayers, we must say, because the volatility was huge just 1 or 2 months ago. And the final change, the final rule I wanted to speak about within this block, also a very important one and very positively perceived by the taxpayers, as we could see in practice, also among our clients, is that the Russian tax authorities, the legislative authorities, created for the taxpayers the possibility to forgive not only intergroup, to forgive the debts without additional tax exposure in Russia. This rule will only apply in 2022, and it basically means that if the Russian taxpayer has some payables under the loan agreement, which was put in place before 1st of March 2022 in front of the foreign creditor, and this foreign creditor decides to forgive this debt now, Russian taxpayer will not be facing any taxable income, which would have been the case before implementation of this rule. Why this change is very important? Currently, we see many cases with the businesses restructuring or even exiting Russia, and the existing foreign shareholders are sometimes willing to forgive any debts before sale or before initiation of the liquidation process, and this now can be done in a tax-neutral manner. Another important thing to mention here is that this rule is not subject to any additional criteria in terms of the shareholding of the foreign creditor in the Russian debtor, meaning that this rule can be used basically with any creditor, including the third-party one. However, for the time being, this specific rules applies only to the debts stemming from the loan arrangements, and unfortunately not to the debts, for example, stemming from the trade payables of the Russian taxpayers. And also, as I mentioned before, this rule is only temporary. It will apply only in 2022 and only for the loans which were put in place before 1st of March and not for the new financing provided. It should be noted here that, again, on this point, the businesses are negotiating with the tax authorities the potential extension of these rules, maybe also to the trade payables or to the new financing for the new tranches provided after the 1st of March. But we will wait and see whether any compromise will be found here. So here I will be happy to pass the floor back to Olga to cover the changes.
Thank you, Masha. Maria has already mentioned a couple of measures which are being introduced to support the liquidity of the Russian subsidiaries and to help to accommodate these crisis circumstances. I will guide you through another couple of measures which are also applicable to the majority of the taxpayers without being industry specific or alike. So, accelerated VAT refund. As many of you may know, if the company is in the position where the input VAT is actually exceeding the amount of output VAT, then this company is eligible to the tax refund, to the VAT refund, which always triggers the tax audit, which may last for 2 months or so, but in practice, the whole procedure of VAT refunds may take around 6 months. So the accelerated VAT refund is not a new measure per se, because it was existing, but it was applicable only to big taxpayers with the huge number of accumulative taxes paid to the to the government and to the federal budget for the 3 preceding years. And this accelerated VAT refund was also available to the companies which were able to submit to the tax authorities the bank guarantee or any other type of surety. This accelerated VAT refund actually provided for an opportunity to get money first and then to pass through the tax audit. Actually, this anti-crisis measure represents the following. Accelerated VAT refund is now available to any company, which means that there is no obligation to comply with any big accumulative amounts of taxes payable to the tax budget, or there is no more the obligation to provide the guarantee or the surety to the tax authorities. However, there are still 2 conditions to be met by the company which would like to apply for accelerated VAT refund, being that the taxpayer should not be in the liquidation or reorganization process, neither should it be in the bankruptcy proceeding. And the amount of VAT which is claimed for this accelerated refund should not exceed the total amount of taxes paid for the preceding year. Actually, if you have the amount which is bigger for the taxes paid for the preceding year, you may still benefit from this accelerated VAT refund, but you have to provide this bank guarantee or the surety to the tax authorities. What is the main benefit of the accelerated VAT refund is, as I have already mentioned, is to get money first and then to pass through the tax audit. The legislation says that you may get your money on the bank account within 11 days, but the Federal Tax Service is giving the promise that you will receive it even faster, within 8 days. We have already the practical experience of helping our clients to pass through this accelerated VAT refund procedure and may confirm that it works. So our clients received the money back on bank accounts actually faster than 11 days. In our particular case, it was around 6 or 8 working days. What you have to be cautious about is the bank account requisites, which you show on the application for accelerated VAT refund, because it may happen that due to any technical reasons whatsoever, the tax authorities may not have your bank account requisites in their database, which may create certain obstacles to get your money on your bank account. But with the rest, it works well, and it's a very efficient liquidity improvement measure. Another change which was temporarily introduced is the opportunity to switch from one option to calculate the corporate income tax payments to the other. The general approach is that the taxpayer calculates the advance payments for the corporate income tax on the basis of the previous corporate income tax indicators, for example, for the previous year or for the previous 9 months or so. What the anti-crisis rule proposes is that you switch to the monthly payments on the basis of the actual profits, which allow you not to overpay the tax, because it may be forecasted that the profits of some of the businesses are going down, which means that if the tax is being paid on the basis of the previous indicators, then the advance payments will represent the overpayment. And if the business is going to liquidate or exit Russia, these overpayments will be hard to get from the budget. So you may seriously consider this change in the options of corporate income tax payments. And again, we have already helped our clients with that. It is also working well without any questions from the tax authorities, because it is heavily supported from the Federal Tax Service. Another technical but maybe valuable for your business's measure is temporarily change in how you qualify your forex differences for the purposes of tax calculation and payments. As a general rule, and many of you may know that both positive and negative unrealized forex differences affect the tax base for the corporate income tax purposes. In the current days of the volatility, this may result in very adverse results of the taxes due. And as anti-crisis rule, it was introduced that it was really interesting, because it's not a mirror measure, because the positive unrealized forex differences will be treated differently from the negative unrealized forex differences. So actually the law is currently proposing and allowing you to exclude unrealized foreign exchange differences for the current year, for the next year, and another one. So for the period of 22-24 years. When you can exclude positive unrealized forex differences from your corporate income tax calculations, whereas you can enjoy including the negative unrealized forex differences for the current year and exclude them for the next year, which will allow you actually only to include for the corporate income tax calculations the forex differences which are already being realized, so at the moment of the payment. And when you reevaluate your current obligations in the foreign currencies, you may skip whatever volatility is going on, and exclude these differences for the purposes of tax calculations. Another measure which was introduced to help the companies with the liquidity is the deferral of social contributions payments. Again, the general rule was that the social contributions are being paid on a monthly basis, actually. And what's changing is that the businesses which are currently operating in Russia may enjoy the deferral for 12 months, so for 1 year, for the second quarter and the third one. The only one thing to mention is here that you have to find your business in the industry which is specifically listed by the government. That being said, means that this measure is industry specific, although the list of industries, for example, which may enjoy this measure is very wide. So the food producers, the electronics distributors, the furniture distributors, and a lot of other businesses are included on the list, which may benefit from this deferral of social contributions payments. Again, back to pandemic times, to replicate the measure, the government introduced the rule that if you underpay the tax and you do not submit the payment to the government for more than 30 days, then the regular key rate and the regular interest rate is applied to this amount of tax underpayment, whereas usually and during peaceful times, when underpayment lasts for more than 30 days, then the key rate or the interest rate is doubling, starting from the 31st day of underpayment. The last but not the least measure which I want to cover today is not really the liquidity support measure, but maybe of your interest if you are considering like transferring the business to the local management or any other benefits for your employees and alike. So what's being introduced is the exemption from the personal income tax of the material gains received by the individuals in certain specific cases. For example, when employee is given the loan by the employer, interest-free, or some goods are sold to the employee below the market level. And what's even more interesting is that the Federal Tax Service was sharing the opinion that when the business is transferred to the local management, for example, for the price which is lower than the usual market price for this business, then this material gain which is being received by the local management is also exempt from personal income taxation. With that, I think I'm done with the temporarily liquidity improvement measures. I'm happy to pass the word back to Maria.
Yes, thank you, Olga. Maybe just a final point to add to your latest section. The tax authorities also confirmed that this exemption will apply to the stock option plans granted to the Russian employees, which is also could be a good news for some of your businesses. And moving to the next section, indeed, the measures that Olga and myself have been covered so far have not been industry specific, or at least applied to a large number of the taxpayers in Russia. However, there is one area of the business which is particularly supported by the Russian authorities, also in the tax domain, which is the IT sphere. Already back in 2020, as a result of the tax maneuver, certain unprecedented tax incentives have been introduced for the qualifying IT companies, including the material reduction of applicable corporate profit tax rate and also social contributions payments. And now the authorities decided to go even further. So first of all, they temporarily reduced the corporate profit tax rate applicable to the qualifying IT companies down to 0%, with this measure applicable until the end of 2024. However, one important thing to mention here is that the company applying to this measure not only should hold the state accreditation certificate as an IT company, which is not a particular complex thing to get, as our colleagues from the IP practice have been telling us, because the right to get this accreditation is generally linked to the specific activity codes used by the company. However, why also for these tax benefits, the company should have at least 7 employees on its payroll, but even more importantly, it should generate at least 90% of its income based on the current rules from the eligible activities. And the scope of these activities, for example, did not include the companies generating the major part of their revenues from the advertising, nor the companies engaged in installation or testing or maintenance of the software, which they did not develop or at least somehow adapt in Russia. Which is why for many of our clients, these rules were not applicable, because they were engaged either in the sub-licensing or in servicing without any modification of the foreign software. And it has been announced that Russian Ministry of Finance, together with the Ministry of the Digital Development, are working together to extend the scope of these eligible IT activities, also to cover the companies generating their revenues from advertising, and those engaged in this installation, testing, and maintenance. However, based on the official texts that were made available so far, these additional activities would apply only to the domestic IT solutions, and will likely not cover the software licensed or sub-licensed from abroad. But we really suggest to wait and see here, because no draft law has been made available to the public yet. If I'm not mistaken, Olga, it is expected by the end of June or something like that, yeah? So
yes,
we will
before this spring session. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we will wait and see what companies will be covered in the end. And one more measure to mention here is the exemption of the qualifying accredited IT companies from the tax audit for the 3 years period. And this measure, interestingly, was introduced not by the law, but by the letter issued by the Russian Federal Tax Service, which is again good news, because at least the IT companies will not be engaging their resources in the tax audit and would focus on their business instead. But one more important thing to note here is this moratorium is not really a net solution, meaning that in 2025, when this moratorium comes to its end, the tax authorities will be more than happy to come and check you for these 3 years to make sure that you were compliant with the incentives that you apply. And on the next slide, just a couple of things to mention also, is that the Russian tax authorities issued a letter stating that even if the existing business in Russia is going through a reorganization with a view to create an IT company which will be benefiting from these tax incentives, this reorganization should not be considered as a sort of a bad faith plea, which is performed with the sole aim to reduce taxes in Russia. And why this letter is so important is that before, the Federal Tax Service issued other letters which contained absolutely different views, stating that, well, each case of business reorganization should be viewed specifically to make sure that it was driven by real business aims and not by the desire to benefit from the tax incentives. So this change of approach is also a good sign for the taxpayers that the tax authorities are more than happy and willing to support the new IT businesses being created in Russia. Also, there are some discussions and initiatives to extend these rules to some related businesses, for example, for the companies engaged in hardware and not only software development, but again, we are suggesting to wait for the final versions of the draft law to see to what companies it will finally apply.
It was actually signed yesterday. Sorry to interrupt you, Masha. So it's a freshly introduced law which was signed yesterday by the President, introducing the accelerated coefficient for depreciation not more than 3 times for some of the software and hardware.
Yes, thank you. And here I think we will move already to a different section. So in the beginning, we wanted to speak about the legislative developments and initiatives. And within the next section, I would rather like to speak about some latest and anticipated tax trends stemming from the practice in Russia. And first of all, I would like to mention that this April, our tax team conducted an offline event with a speaker from the tax services, from the Interregional Tax Inspection #1, focusing on the largest international businesses. And this speaker was particularly dedicated to the problematic of deductibility and documentation of intergroup services costs, the so-called management fees. And I know that this topic is still very important for the majority of our clients, being the international groups. And this tax inspection and this tax inspector in particular are regarded by the business as the trendsetters who are engaged in the most important tax audits in the for the international businesses in this domain. Which is why we wanted to summarize by the next 2 slides for the international audience, not generally this topic, which I'm sure many of you are well aware of, but some practical hints that the tax inspector focused on during the Q&A section, which could be used as a sort of a guideline for you for documentation of your costs for the future periods. First of all, the inspector drew the attention of the taxpayers to the fact that when the group reimburses certain specific costs to its Russian subsidiaries using the intragroup services mechanism, for example, insurance costs or advertising costs, which are subject to specific deductibility criteria, either in terms of their size or in terms of their documentation, then these criteria should be met also for the costs incurred by the foreign service provider reimbursing this cost to the Russian entity. Also, the tax authorities mentioned that in practice they quite frequently see the cases when the international group has various subsidiaries or various forms of presence in Russia and accumulates all of its intergroup costs on one particular subsidiary because they, well, maybe do not want to get engaged in putting in place other intergroup flows with other subsidiaries. And the tax authorities are viewing this kind of situation rather negatively, and they check each time that these costs are reimbursed either in fair proportion or are directly connected to each particular subsidiary who will be ultimately deducting these costs. Which is basically the message for you is that if you have several subsidiaries in Russia, check carefully which subsidiary you bill for the particular service. From the practical standpoint, the tax authorities mentioned that the taxpayers should not be scared that the tax audit in respect of the intergroup services costs will be initiated like out of the blue. It never actually happens in Russia, and any such tax audit, which is really time-consuming both for the tax authorities and the taxpayers, is usually preceded by material work and by the pre-audit procedures, where the tax authorities first ask for some specific documents, and they may invite the management for interrogations, and only if they are dissatisfied with what they get, they open the tax audit. So again, this is a message for you that if the tax authorities tend to pay particular attention to your intergroup services costs, please do not disregard their requests, even if they are not placed in terms of a specific tax audit, because after that they can actually come back to you already with a tax audit. The tax authorities also reassured, and again, this is a very important question for many of our clients, is that when the tax audit is initiated, and if the taxpayer asks for some additional time to provide the documents, which is basically almost every case, because the official timing to answer the request of the tax authorities is very limited in Russia. The tax pay is always granted by this additional time, but it is always granted for the first time, but it should not be used as a tool to somehow try and play games with the tax authorities, meaning that if the taxpayer, for example, asks for 2 or 3 additional weeks, the tax authorities expect that upon expiry of this additional term, the taxpayer will actually come back with the requested documents and not give one paper and then ask for 2 or 3 weeks more. In this case, most probably the answer will be no. Also, we specifically discussed with the tax authorities the approach to the translation of the documents, because it's a difficult task to collect all these documents, which can be hundreds and thousands of the files. But after that, you also have to translate this into Russian, which is again additional timing constraints and administrative resources. Here, the approach is not that positive, unfortunately. The inspector mentions that this very much depends on your particular inspection and whether or not they have English-speaking experts in their team to check your documents in English. However, it is always a negotiation point. So if you have some issues with this, please come and speak to your inspector. Please suggest some ways that could optimize the work on your side. And if they are in a position to agree to your suggestions, they will most probably do it. But here the inspector mentioned, and I fully agree with this, that we still very much suggest that you translate yourself the key documents to make sure that the meaning is not lost in translation. And another very important point here is that the tax inspector announced a more progressive approach to the use of the flat allocation keys as a pricing methodology for the intergroup services. Because as many of you remember, that even we in our advice usually said that it is a red flag to the tax authorities, and in most of the cases it is still a no-go. But now the tax authorities say that, well, we try to understand better the economic rationale behind each pricing methodology used, but also they come and check the transparency and the consistency of the pricing methodology applies throughout the group, meaning that to come and draw, like, you know, the artificial timesheet only for the Russian entity when the tax inspection finds out that for the rest of the group the pricing methodology is different, is really no longer a way in Russia. I would still be very cautious with this particular initiative and this particular approach, which again very much varies from one type of services to another. However, again, this is at least a good sign that the tax payers and the international groups are being heard. And moving on to the next slide, some more things that were mentioned is that, first of all, the tax authorities repeated that when they challenge the deductibility of intergroup services costs, in most of the cases, almost automatically, they would also insist on application of withholding tax. But the applicable rate and the possibility to rely on the double taxation treaties in this particular domain would very much depend on the reasons for challenging the cost, and also on the way the tax authorities interpret this kind of flows, whether they qualify this into dividends or some other flows, or they at all challenge the reality of the operation. And very importantly, the tax authorities said that if such a requalification into dividends takes place, we should always look on the DTT applicable with the shareholder, even if the services come from some other company located in some other jurisdiction. Meaning that if they requalify the services flows into dividends, no matter that, for example, your service provider is in Spain, but your shareholder is in France, so you always apply the French DTT in this case. In terms of the requalification, they also mentioned that the challenging the deductibility of the cost for the corporate profit tax purposes should not automatically mean that the tax authorities will also challenge the VAT offset. Well, again, a good sign, but I would be still very cautious with this, especially with the regional tax inspection. I will actually stop on the particular intergroup services deductibility point here, just because we are running short of time, but I will be happy to discuss this particular topic with any of you. And one more change, one more anticipated change is that we wanted to mention here is that it is expected that together with the new incentives for the IT business I was talking about earlier today, the tax authorities will also introduce changes to the taxation of electronic services. As many of you know, we anticipated for a couple of years already that the tax authorities will at least exclude the intergroup flows from the scope of e-services application. But now, in the current situation, when many foreign providers of electronic services have issues with paying VAT to the Russian budget due to their internal limitations or sanctions, the tax authorities will most likely be willing to come back to the tax agency mechanism to any such e-services flows, whether intergroup ones or those stemming from the third-party service providers. The tax authorities already issued a letter earlier this year urging the Russian taxpayers acquiring the electronic services to voluntarily act as tax agents in respect to the VAT from such flows. And now we expect this to be incorporated in the law, well, hopefully very soon. And I think...
Yes, and if you experience any difficulties with transferring the payments for electronically supplied services, we specifically for you included the question or the feedback form, which you may fill in with the relevant information, including the information of the bank which is being used for these purposes. I mean, if you feel comfortable to share this information. Because again, the tax authorities are understanding the problem and are eager to resolve it in the way convenient for the businesses. Can I come on, Masha? Yeah?
Yes, sure. I just wanted to pass the floor to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. That were really the insights. Because those are not in the law, but those are just in the minds of the tax inspections and of the Federal Tax Service. That is why I think we may benefit from that and being well equipped with that knowledge. As promised before, and as a last section of our webinar today, we want to share with you about what's going on around the international business in the Russian landscape. What are the options which are being considered by the international businesses in the current circumstances, and what are the legal frameworks and the tax consequences of any of the options and frameworks which follow any of them. So again, you may know or you may not that it is widely discussed in the media that almost all the international businesses are exiting Russia, which may be true to a certain extent, because we notice certain liquidations which are being initiated, but would not be fair to say that this is equally fair for the whole international business society and community. What is also being observed and noticed by us and other associations is that some of the international businesses are still in the suspension mode or in a so-called idle time regime, which means that the business is there, the entity is there, the business operations are stopped or temporarily suspended. People are still receiving their money as salaries, and the management is considering what to do next. In the early March, this suspension was caused not only by the wider sanctions and political landscape, but also by the huge difficulties with the logistics. which definitely requires certain time to be resolved. That is why those businesses are still in the suspension mode. If you are in that mode, or if you are considering this option, definitely the first priority for you would be the employment issues, because you will still be in charge of the employees which you have on board. Definitely, we observe the decrease of certain business operations of certain businesses, where they claim and actually do the limitations of investments and marketing expenses on the Russian market, which actually means that, for example, they do not open new projects, they do not build new factories, they do not, I don't know, introduce new R&D researchers, but they continue doing what they do. Meaning that they a bit freeze the size of the business and are not looking for the growth anymore, but are focusing on the operational efficiency and on keeping the presence maintenance on the Russian market in the shape which they reached before the early March. So some of the companies are really understanding that there is a huge expertise being collected for the previous 30 years, and a lot of people are highly educated. I mean, not only through the universities, but through the business experience which they had with the multinationals. So they opt to restructure the business, which means that some of the companies, again, relocates the employees. Some of the companies may change the form of the legal presence on the Russian market. And these businesses may consider engaging the former employees as freelancers or subcontractors, or any other forms of onboarding and keeping people who were previously employed. In all of the two previous options which I have mentioned, what you should be cautious about is, from the tax perspective, is the permanent establishment issue, is the issue of the deemed employment with the associated tax consequences, and certain VAT consequences as well. Which doesn't mean that there is no very well working options. Our experience shows that whatever business task is given to us, we may find the appropriate legal form to accommodate this business task. But again, with certain pros and cons, and with certain benefits and risks from the tax side to be considered. And definitely the most obvious and the most dramatic options for the businesses which seriously consider to cease or stop the business operations in Russia, or even completely exit Russia, those are definitely going into the dormant mode, or to the liquidation process. I will say a bit more words about these two widely used options, because they may have certain specifics and differences from what you may have in the EU or in other jurisdictions. For example, when we are saying about going dormant, it will mean, from the Russian perspective, a bit different from what you may come across in Europe. Because in Russia, dormancy doesn't mean really some specific status which is being submitted to the tax authorities or to the other states' authorities. It only means that the business operations stop, but the entity is still there. And to the extent the legal entity is there, the law still requires to be in compliance with certain minimum requirements at least, which means to keep the legal address and the lease agreement which is needed to keep the legal address, to have the general director and the head of the rep office or the branch, depending on your form of the presence which you have. You have to be able to reply and respond to the state authorities within the tough deadlines with any information which they may request. And which is the most important, you have to file all the reporting which is required for fully operating businesses, including the tax reporting and the statutory reporting, even if they are nil. If you just put zeros into those reporting, the mere fact that the legal entity or the branch or the rep office exists will require from you to submit the reporting to the state authorities. If you made your mind and decided to exit Russia completely, meaning that you are ready to liquidate the legal presence in Russia, you have to keep in mind probably, obvious consequences that when business is exiting and being liquidated, before it is liquidated, the tax authorities should have the opportunity to check your previous tax obligations and to find any mistakes or underpayments which you may probably made in the past, which means that if you go for the liquidation option, you most probably find yourself in the tax audit procedure. During this tax audit, the tax authorities will be able to check for the 3 preceding years the correctness of calculating of all the tax obligations which the company may had in the past. Corporate income taxation, value-added taxation, personal income taxation, and so on. So what is really heavily recommended before you go for that option is to make certain preparatory work before you enter that procedure. Taxes are not the only thing on the to-do list before you go for a liquidation, because you have to check for the commercial issues, for the employment issues, and specifically you should keep in mind the risk of intentional bankruptcy, which may be imposed, which may realize for the business when you have not enough liquidity to cover your outstanding obligations. Some of the international businesses were specifically interested in the legal risks which come along with the liquidation. One of them I have already mentioned, being the intentional insolvency, because it may create really severe consequences for the local management and certain consequences for the shareholders. And one more thing to mention is that the government is considering some specific measures like external management for the companies, which are very important for the economy of the Russian Federation as a whole, or of the economy of the specific region where the business is location. For example, when we're talking about production facilities or other very labor-intensive businesses. External management is the specific procedure when the government would like to avoid the situation when the international business simply stops the operations, and then this causes the interruption of the supply chains of crucially important products, or when it causes the increase of the unemployment rate. That is why the external management is the procedure which will be introduced to those crucially important businesses to keep them still operating. If any details of that procedure is of your interest, we will be happy to discuss those offline, since we are running out of time. But anyway, this is a very interesting institute and tool which is being introduced, although it's very heavily discussed and challenged by the business community here in Russia. I think with that we are done, and we are happy to talk through your questions, which we welcomed on our chat box.
Yeah,
I think the first one was to you, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. So the first question concerns the transfer pricing problematics. If an intercompany transaction is no longer profitable due to much higher transportation costs based on the current situation, Will there be any flexibility on the profit level examined by the tax authorities? Well, actually, this is a very good question and is very much related to what we have been speaking about. First of all, we need to look at the transaction at stake. What are we talking about? Is it importation? Is it exportation? Is it something else? Because, as I said, for the exportation of the goods produced in Russia, there was an official letter issued by the tax authorities saying that they understand why these transactions could be loss-making in the current circumstances. For other types of transactions, most importantly, importation of the goods, the situation doesn't look so good so far. As I was explaining, because the position of the tax authorities looks a little bit conservative. I should say that in the Russian tax code, we have some general rules which allow the taxpayers to make certain adjustments when they calculate their profitability and compare it with the arm's length level. And such adjustments may be aimed at ensuring the comparability of the tested transactions. And the tax authorities may say that, well, we look at the 3-year period of the comparable companies which are preceding the year 2022, and these years are actually very different, although there was a pandemic, which is why we want to withdraw some extraordinary costs or maybe recalculate certain revenues and so on. But all these tools are not very well developed in Russia. They are not set as such in the tax code. So we usually work with our clients on a case-by-case basis to elaborate some proper justification. And also, as I mentioned during the first slide, so we are now having this initiative that we are trying to collect from the business the more specific examples why you are loss-making, why you are not in a position to include this extraordinary logistic costs in the final price that you charge to your independent clients and so on. And on this basis, hopefully, we will be in a position to elaborate some more specific explanations from the side of the tax authorities. So I think the next question is you, Olga.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Masha, for the reply. Next question is about the VAT refund and how to calculate this threshold within which the accelerated VAT refund is possible. So the question is whether the limit of total amount of taxes paid for the preceding year applies to each individual VAT refund or the VAT accumulated refunds. Actually, interesting question, and I may be returning to you offline separately because I will need to check my understanding. There are very detailed explanations how to calculate this amount of taxes previously paid. My general understanding is that it's per one return. So you have the amount of the VAT refund which you would like to claim, for example, for the second quarter. Then you take the previous year and you compare both amounts, which actually provide for the opportunity to transfer input VAT and recovery deduction of the input VAT for the next quarter. When another VAT refund will be available to you. So the short answer would be you should not accumulate all your expected VAT refunds and compare them to the amount of previously paid taxes. You have to concentrate on the current VAT refunds for the current quarter. But I will check a second time for you, and we'll come back to you separately to confirm this.
Okay, I will take the next question then. So I guess that regarding taxation of intercompany services, the withholding tax will refer to the DTT applicable in the respective period and not the current status of DTT. Well, the tax authorities will be looking at the DTT applicable when the actual payment for the services was made. So you are right. If you paid for the services, for example, back in 2018, and then the DTT, like with Cyprus or Luxembourg, was changed, they should look at the DTT applicable as the period of the payment.
Yes, thank you, Masha. Another question goes from Lilia. So what are the criteria to choose the option to decrease or stop the business operations in Russia? Actually, this is a very long question, and again, maybe taken offline. So basically, the starting point is the decision, the court decision. Are you here or you go? Because a lot of companies are experiencing the pressure from the international community to squeeze or to seize the operations to the maximum extent possible in Russia. But they understand that the efforts which were undertaken for the previous 30 years cannot be like eliminated for 1 second. So they literally sit and think twice whether it's worth going away and lose the market because another player will come, and they will definitely come because local players are currently very active on the market and are seeking for the opportunities and niches which will be free after the multinationals will leave. So this is a very important commercial point to consider together with the management. With the rest, from the legal standpoint, actually one option may be less requiring and demanding from the standpoint of the efforts, and another will require a lot. For example, any option which requires certain negotiations with the employees requires definitely the severance payments and the other payments to the employees. So it's again pros and cons of the specific situation. But I will be happy to come back to you, Lilia, separately to consider your case and to be precise in my answer. Am I correct? Is that there are no new questions coming in?
There is one more question, Ola, I can answer and you may add. Is it recommended to first have the company dormant for 3 years before voluntary liquidation? So I guess the answer is simple, yes it is, because if the tax authorities come and check you when the liquidation process is initiated, they will only look into the so-called dormancy years and will likely not find too many tax arrears here. So yeah, I think so.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. What will be visible to them is the dramatic change in the tax obligations, which will happen once you go dormant. Yeah, and this may cause certain like requests from the tax authorities, but again, any change in the business operations may cause questions from the tax authorities. So this should not be a stopper for you.
Yeah, of course, provided that you still comply with all the reporting and payment obligations that Olga was speaking about in her section.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, absolutely fair. We've seen the cases when those compliance obligations are disregarded. It's actually not worth seriously considering because it's more burdensome than to comply with those not really burdensome requirements. Sharp timing, I should say. 1 minute. Oh, another question?
Yes, Olga, if you allow, we have just a couple of minutes left. So it's just a completion to the first question on the transfer pricing that I was taking. So so this question was related to the exportation transactions. Well, then good luck to you. You should follow within the scope of this new letters that I was speaking about. However, I would still suggest you to be very cautious and to look in a detail what exactly caused your losses and what exactly your additional logistic costs are related to, because this letter speaks about the sanctions. This letter does not speak about other conditions such as volatility and so on. And also this letter doesn't speak about the counter sanctions coming from Russia. It mainly speaks about the unfriendly states and so on. So yes, it's better news for you, but still there is a lot of room for additional analysis.
Yeah, I think with that we are done and we may close our webinar. And we want to warmly thank you for you being present with us for a bit more than 1 hour and for being present with us and partnering with us for any tax and legal questions which you may have. Again, just to repeat that today for you we're talking mainly Maria Kabanova, Senior Associate in our tax practice. She is leading a lot of initiatives and is very active in communicating with the tax authorities. That is why I would really appreciate and to a certain extent encourage you to fill in the questionnaire which you receive as a follow-up to this webinar. Because if, again, with your approval and if you don't mind, that information will be fed back to the tax authorities to improve the current tax landscape for your benefit. And myself, Olga Odintsova, we are always here for you for any of your questions. I'm happy to share all the news through the Tax and Talk Telegram channel, and this is subscription to our email alerts. With that, please take care. Do your business. I don't know. Continue doing what you do, and stay with us. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, colleagues. Goodbye.